Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. It's Cynicalex, and we were long overdue for a brand new tier list, so here it is. Thank you for waiting. The MFF 7.6.5 tier list brought to you by yours truly, Cynicalex. PSA, this is just my opinion. Feel free to build up whoever you want. Now, I'm not going to discuss, the only thing I'm not going to be discussing in this video is the broad changes that were made to the tier list organization last month or 2 months ago. I'll leave a link up in the top right corner for those of you that want to go back and watch that video and get up to date. What does borderline mean? What does meta gods mean? What does this stuff mean? Why is this here? That's all discussed in that video. I'm going to leave that there. Second thing, we have a lot of characters to go through and a lot of uniforms and stuff because I'm catching up basically 2 updates. So we're going to go a little bit faster than usual, explaining the justification for these characters' rankings. Last but not least, there's a big black border, a BBB, around characters that I think are going to be getting or could be getting an update soon. I'm only going to go 1 update in advance, so people who are like, oh, bold for Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, or you should be bolding for Thor, Love and Thunder. We're just going to go 1 update in advance. I'm guessing, and a lot of people in the community are guessing, that January update is going to be Spider-Man No Way Home, because December traditionally doesn't have a full update. December is traditionally just for like a small update with a couple of uniforms, and they just bring back the holiday uniforms like Gwenpool, Holiday Lady Deadpool, White Fox, stuff like that. So assuming that this is correct, January should see something, some new uniforms for Spider-Man, hopefully a rework for Spider-Man, maybe something for Electro based on the trailers and information we've gotten, maybe something for Green Goblin, we don't know, Willem Dafoe kind of thing. Not trying to spoil the movie for you guys. I haven't even been watching the trailers myself besides the very first one, but I just wanted to bold these characters just as sort of a reminder in case any of you out there are looking through, perusing the tier list, and then, oh, maybe Dr. Octopus will get a new update, Alfred Molina, right? So maybe I'll start collecting bios for him, or maybe I won't buy his Superior Octopus uniform, or whatever the case may be. So it's just a small reminder here. Their positions on the tier list have not changed at all. And they're, as you can see, they're mostly bad characters, and that's no surprise here because some of these characters were introduced in 2016 or 2017 and have not gotten anything since then, like Kraven and Rhino and Sandman. So yeah, it is what it is, but I just wanted to do that as sort of like a fun reminder and a fun way for us to look ahead without taking the focus off of what is in front of us, which is all of the new characters and new uniforms that we got vis-a-vis Eternals, and then the Asgard Invasion update. So one more thing before we get into that, I want to discuss 2 characters that I moved down on the tier list from their original position. Actually, a couple more than 2 characters. I moved 1 character up. Actually, 3 characters. Okay, sorry. So Luna Snow, I moved her down from meta defining to meta gods because of what I'm going to explain with Makari. All you basically need to know is Luna just got bumped a little bit by Makari. It doesn't mean that Luna Snow is worse in any way, shape, or form now. However, in Rescue's case, she was bumped and made worse because she was in meta gods, and now I've bumped her to basically the bottom of meta-ish. Granted, I'll admit, I think I overreacted and I put her higher than she should have been. I sort of overvalued Rescue, but essentially she's only really good now for, she was only really good and she only is really good now for PvP. She was really just doing Alliance Conquest and Alliance Tournament, and to a lesser extent, the Timeline Survival. But now with Dimension Rifts, you don't need her as much for time. You don't even really need to play Timeline Survival as much if you don't want to. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm just saying. And then for PvP, she was knocked out of Alliance Tournament with the introduction of the Eternals and other characters. So she's basically just doing AC stuff. So I think that's really where she belongs, kind of thing. And then for Ebony Maw, I bumped him down from meta gods to meta-ish because, again, his damage is not going to keep up with newer, better blast characters. And then on the support side of things, we're seeing more and more good PvP characters come out that are not universal. And Ebony Maw's passive depends on fighting against universals. So because of that, his value starts to slide a little bit. It doesn't mean that he's worse. He's still an amazing support, but just that we're recognizing the changing landscape of PvP and we're adjusting things ever so slightly. But most of his value here comes from the fact that he checks a lot of universals in PvP and punishes you for using an all-universal team. So that's basically it for those. Oh, and then last but not least, I moved Wolverine up. He is ABX meta for all 3 combat hero seasons, and he is also still very good for PvP, especially if you have his artifact. I will try to make note of where characters need their artifacts more or less, but yeah, it is something to keep in mind. So we're going to start off with meta defining, and this one is interesting because you shouldn't see that many changes to the meta in terms of meta defining unless the game is going through like a big influx. We're getting like a brand new game mode, or a game mode's getting taken down and revamped or something like that. But recently we have gotten some pretty big shifts, Makari being, in my opinion, the biggest one. For the longest time, Luna Snow was the reigning queen of ABX for any sort of speed hero, speed female. She just rocked it all top to bottom, regardless of build, regardless of whoever came up. No one came close to matching her, especially not in all 3 seasons, despite the fact that Luna doesn't have paralysis, burn, or silence. She doesn't have any of those effects, but she just stayed winning until Makari showed up. Makari can keep pace. Makari can do as much and score as much points as Luna Snow in some cases with the CTP of energy, which is unheard of considering that most builds require a rage or a mighty or brilliant judgment in the case of characters that can use the elemental damage like Luna, or a brilliant energy in the case of very specific, very few characters like Summer Days Cable. But Makari rocks the show, and her power extends far beyond ABX. She rocks World Boss Ultimate, like without any builds whatsoever. She rocks World Boss Legend. She can even do a little bit of PvP. And the best part about Makari, unlike some of the other characters I'm going to mention, is that she does not rely on her artifact to do the vast majority of her damage. Like, whereas Wolverine is meta for PvP but requires his artifact to really compete, Makari is meta for ABX even without her artifact. Not to mention the fact that you can farm it, and there's not that much difference between a 3-star and a 6-star artifact for Makari. I mean, you are talking a few 100,000 points, but in the grand scheme of things, you're still hitting those top scores regardless. And she has 2 of the 3. I believe she has burn she definitely has paralysis, and I think she also has silence or burn on her 6 skills. But yeah, Makari just completely blows the competition out of the water and basically sets the pace for speed types. She's basically the prototype, and she's the one to beat now for all speed types in the game, which is crazy. And then we have Hela coming out of nowhere to revitalize not only PvP but PvE. And I'm a little bit high on Hela right now for PvP, despite the fact that I do think Hela is a little bit of a trap character for PvE, and I'll sort of explain what I'm saying. As a PvP character, because of her passive giving all allies this massive boost against heroes, Hela creates a counter to teams that are just going to spam Sentry and spam a bunch of heroes, even teams that are going to spam Eternals, because a lot of Eternals teams are going to use the Cersei buffs and maybe the Icarus buffs with the Gilgamesh buffs, right? They're going to use at least Cersei and Gilgamesh because they mix together so well and they provide buffs to both Eternals teammates. Hela checks that. Hela really does stop you from doing that and really allows players to punch up with a weaker team just because of those buffs. However, despite how good she seems and how good she is in PvE, I do think that players are going to have, I don't want to say they're going to have disappointment, but I think they're going to struggle a little bit more as Hela climbs. Hela is very, very good for PvE, don't get me wrong. I don't think she's good for ABX, but she's very, very good for PvE, and she hits super duper hard with her 6. But I think the thing that's going to sort of hold her back from really competing with the top end characters, even though she's like Dr. Doom in the sense that she has the accumulation and the big boom 6 skill, is the fact that she does so little damage on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you really have to line everything up perfectly and nail the 6. And if you miss your proc, or your proc is late, which is not even under your control at all, right? There's only a 10% or 20% chance that it triggers. Then you're not going to get any damage, or you're going to get, substantially less damage. So I think she's one of those characters that's not consistent enough for maybe some players' likings. So I will put that as an asterisk. Consistency is really key when it comes to being meta defining, and you can see all these characters here are extremely consistent. Like Loki's extremely consistent for PvE content, Doom is extremely consistent for PvP and pretty consistent for PvE, Sentry's extremely consistent for PvP and decent for PvE, right? They all do that. Hela, we have to wait and see how consistent she is for PvP. Right now she's mostly a support, and then on the PvP side, and then on the PvE side, I think her consistency is what's going to hold her back and what may end up knocking her back into meta gods. She's still very good, don't get me wrong, but I do think the consistency is something to keep in mind. And personally, if I could redesign the character, tweak the character just a little bit, I would take maybe 15 or 20% of her damage on 6 and just slide it back into her 5th, 4th, and 3rd skills, because really, you don't want a character that's putting all of their eggs into one basket, right? It usually doesn't end up staying meta for that long, and it usually doesn't end up being the most fun to play, at least in my experience. But obviously you're the judge at the end of the day and who you want to play with. Moving on to the meta gods category, we actually have a very healthy mix of PvP and PvE value here. Gilgamesh is almost like 70-80% PvP, but he really does bring back the old days of these like 50-50 stalemates in PvP. If you're not careful and you bring a defensive team against a Gilgamesh that has his artifact especially, you're going to run into an issue and you're not going to be able to kill him, and you're going to have to watch that clock run down from 5 minutes to 0. It's happened to me, it's happened to other players. So he really does create a shift that we haven't seen in a while. There are ways to get around it. There are characters that can punch through his defenses, and obviously if you're using a team like Hela, it helps a lot. Or if you're using a bunch of blast types. But I do think that as we get more and more of these super tanky combat types, it's going to bring back blast types, and it's also going to bring back this counterplay of, you know, damage to heroes or damage to villains or molecule man or what have you. But yeah, really strong in PvP, and maybe a little bit better than some people think for PvE, although I think people are sort of getting tired of the I need to accumulate before I can do damage taken type of characters, right? Like we saw shit, we've had Sharon Rogers for years, then we saw Doctor Doom and we were like, okay, and then we saw War Machine and we were like, okay, and now we have Hela and we're like, okay. I think people are just getting a little bit tired of it, and it's not always the most fun type of gameplay. And what's a little bit more unfortunate on top of that is that it seems like a lot of these accumulation characters end up being combat, like, you know, Luke Cage, Gilgamesh, etc. And for World Boss Legend, Mephisto's Blast. So you have the type disadvantage on the boss that's going to help you accumulate the most, which is a little bit, it stings a little bit extra. And then we have Cersei, Kingo, and Thena. Now, Cersei's really interesting because although I think she's not going to be overall, it's tough. I think overall she's not going to be as dominant in PvP as Gilgamesh, although she is basically, she's almost needed for Gilgamesh. It's weird. It's kind of like Jessica Jones in a way. That is without her artifact. Without Cersei's artifact, she's basically just there to buff Gilgamesh or buff whoever else. With Cersei's artifact, she basically becomes a time bomb where you may be able to kill her without her killing you once, but she's just going to revive and trigger her awakening skill right away, and she's going to get off at least one kill. So she guarantees you one hit in PvP. She's good for PvE. Again, it's a bit of that, I need to take damage before I can do my thing. Fatigue that players are seeing in a lot of these recent characters, and that some of the game modes and some of the way that damage is calculated, it doesn't really make it inducive or conductive to taking hits and then attacking back. Or you have characters that need to take hits but they don't have super armor, so they get knocked back and you get interrupted. So I mean, Cersei's still really good for PvE, don't get me wrong, but sure, her consistency in PvP cannot be undervalued, and she basically is the engine that makes that Eternals PvP team run for all different types of content. She's seeing play in Timeline Battle, ABS, or Alliance Conquest, Alliance Tournament, and her passive is still really good for being a support in PvE content. So she really is very good. Not quite meta defining, but she's really on the cusp there with how much value she brings in a singular character, especially when you combine her with other Eternals. Kingo is just a solid awakening character, despite initially looking kind of bad. I do think he's better than Human Torch. He does sort of need a CTP, as some of the other characters do, but I think he's a little underrated, and I'll try to show some more content on how good he is, but I do think he's good, despite, again, having a bit of an awkward rotation, which, in a different sort of way compared to Hela, it still isn't going to be the most attractive for some players who don't want to be constantly spamming buttons and sort of playing this frenetic gameplay style. But in terms of how much damage he can deal, and in terms of all the buffs that he has access to with the White Fox leadership and being a blast hero, a male, and etc., he can help you climb pretty high, and he is also a discounted transcended character, which is nice. And he doesn't, although you benefit from Cersei, he's not going to need Cersei as much as, let's say, Human Torch needs Thing to climb, whereas Kingo needing White Fox to climb is better for your account overall, because White Fox buffs so many other characters, whereas Thing only buffs Human Torch, Invisible Woman himself, and Maker. Then we have Thena. Thena, I think, again, is still a little underrated. I think players are still upset that she needed to get buffed so much, like offensively and defensively, but she's very good. She competes with Scarlet Witch for ABX, or does better. I don't really care. I'm not really here to say which one, because some players very defensive of Scarlet Witch are going to say she's better, but the fact that Thena with a Rage can enter the conversation when Scarlet Witch has a Mighty or a Brilliant Judgment that to me says all that it needs to say. On top of the fact that I was able to clear stage 39 of Mephisto with an obelisk on Thena, really blew my mind. Again, she has access to all of the Eternals buffs, although she isn't going to be much value for PvP, which is not really surprising considering there's very few universals outside of these that are good for PvP. She's very, very good for PvE, and she seems flexible. ABX, World Boss Ultimate, World Boss Legend, Squad Battle. The only thing that Thena's really missing is high all defense down, which makes her a less than ideal target to run your dispatch teams or run your Dimension Rift teams on auto, which I was hoping she would be good for because she has such a good lead, and good leaderships that also do good damage are rare, right? Usually characters that have really high damage don't have good leaderships, right? Moonstone, Sharon Rogers, terrible leaderships for PvE. Godly characters for PvE. Makari, so good for PvE. Garbage leadership for PvE. Supergiant has a PvP lead, right? So I was hoping that Thena would be the full package. Maybe we're expecting a little bit too much from her. I think that's what it is, but I do think she's very, very good. Sif, on the other hand, I think disappointed some people, but as a sort of B-tier character in terms of popularity, I think she fits right where she should be, right above a character like Apocalypse. She definitely has more flexibility, and I do think that you can argue she's going to bring more value to your roster than someone like Maker, and maybe even more value than someone like Valkyrie. So I do think that Sif could make the jump up here. I'm just going to let her sit here for now because I don't want to overvalue her, and I have Rescue ringing in the back of my mind like, don't make that mistake again. So we're putting her here for now. She may, I feel kind of uncomfortable calling Sif a meta god because as we saw, she's not going to compete in World Boss Legend at all, so that game mode kind of gets knocked out as a main damage dealer. But as a leadership slash support, she's very, very good within the combat class. Keep in mind, the leadership only applies to combats, so she is sort of, she's hitting that glass ceiling because she has to buff characters that, generally speaking, are not that good for PvE content anyways, especially when it comes to World Boss Legend. And then with Shang-Chi, you could almost use his own leadership and get almost the same buff anywho. So it's just basically the support buff. But the support buff is very, very good. Her support buff is underrated, and it's very strong. And then last but not least, we have Icarus and Heimdall. I wish I had better things to say. I really wish I did. A lot of people are still getting at me in the comments to get the devs, to pester the devs to buff Icarus. Icarus is tough. Unlike Thena, who was obviously too weak at the time, Icarus is not, he could get a buff. You're not wrong. But lots of characters could get a buff, right? Lots of characters could get a buff. So I do feel like with Icarus, it's sort of on the line. It's sort of skirting the line between the community being too demanding and wanting too many things in every single character versus Icarus just not meeting people's expectations. Yes, he's the leader of the Eternals. Yes, you know, he gets first billing in the movie. He's there side by side with Cersei because they're trying to build up this love interest. Richard Madden is awesome. But on the other hand, like, he's got a 4% heal under 99 like Wolverine used to have. He's got iframe ignore, etc. He's got a lot of weapons available to him. Could they tweak his damage a little bit? Yeah. Could they tweak his survivability a bit? Yeah. Do some players make him work with a max build in PvP? Yeah. Yeah, they do. They do make him work. So I'm actually going to give him that there. The only real thing that I think the devs should look into for sure with Icarus is the autoplay rotation. His autoplay rotation is terrible, and that could definitely be remedied easily by the devs. Or maybe it's not easy, but I don't know. But they should still remedy it because it's frustrating to watch your Icarus do the absolute worst skills possible and then end up dying over and over again. But I do think you may be surprised at how good an Icarus can be when you pair him with Gilgamesh in PvP. Again, when you pair him with Cersei in PvE, he's not really going to go that far, and we can see when we compare Icarus to Thena just how much better she is. But then again, she's a lot more expensive, so it would also be kind of weird if Icarus was as good as Thena and 1/5 the price, right? So I don't know. Icarus is kind of in a weird position. I do feel kind of bad for him, but at the same time, I understand why not every character can be super meta. He's got a great leadership. He's got pretty good passives. He's a decent counter to villains in PvP before Hela showed up. Now with Hela here, that might just be the nail in the coffin for him for PvP. And then for PvE, yeah, anything that he can do, Thena can do better. So yeah, I would just say if you're going to build Icarus, maybe just look a little bit higher on the tier list. He's just not that good. You know, he's going to be a lead support soon. A couple more updates, he's going to get knocked out of this. Thanos is going to get knocked out too, and they're going to go down here into the lead support category. And then last but not least, we have Heimdall. A little bit better than I thought and other players thought as far as his PvP potential goes, but I don't want to overstate the value here. I know there's been some hype videos by Beast Mode Gaming and Commander and stuff, and that's all well and good and cool, but you have to put in a ton of resources to get your Heimdall to perform, and that to me is already sort of not a red flag, but kind of like a yellow light that, you know, maybe he's really being carried by the things around him and not necessarily his own character. Because yeah, it's a meta tier list, so we do need to imagine these characters at their maximums, but then we also need to imagine how big is that gap, right? If you take away Heimdall's artifact, how far does he drop? In PvP, he drops a heck of a lot because the artifact does so much for him. So I wanted to mention the artifacts more in the video, but you know, for PvP, Cersei's artifact is basically a must. Otherwise, she's much worse for PvP. For Gilgamesh, it's basically the same thing. For Wolverine, basically the same thing. For Makari, she does not rely on her artifacts to carry the majority of her damage. For Hela, she does not rely on her artifact at all for PvE, but she absolutely relies on the artifact for PvP, especially considering you kind of need to give her a destruction for PvP so that she can penetrate, because she doesn't have any native penetration at all. Same thing goes for Heimdall, and kind of the problem here. He can seem better than he is if you were lucky enough or have the funds for a 5 or 6 star artifact, sure. And maybe he can punch up and fight here in this category in PvP. But then without it, he's, you know, much more average. And so I have to weigh those things at the same time when I'm considering these characters, and considering that you can't give a max build to every character. And even if you had a 6 star artifact selector, Heimdall wouldn't be the 1st or 5th or 10th character, maybe the 10th character that you'd use it on, but there are so many better characters that you would use it on first, that it sort of just becomes unreasonable to expect people to have that on him. So that being said, Heimdall is really, I think, one of the first characters we've seen that was built with the artifact in mind, and I'm not a big fan of that, and I hope the devs do not continue to do that, because Heimdall gets an offensive and defensive buff with his artifact, which is, in my opinion, too much. And especially when that defensive buff is a heal. When it's a revive, it also hurts, but a heal hurts a lot, because heals can also be good for PvE, right? If you're dying in World Boss Legend with Cersei, you're doing other things wrong. But for Heimdall, you could have a really good run, get a little bit unlucky, and then he dies. But then you're like, oh man, if I had his artifact. So yeah, I don't want to see more characters that basically need their artifacts to be good, because that's a little bit more stressful, and it doesn't really capture the true value of the character. It captures the value of an item that you give to the character. And that's sort of like saying, well, you know, Iron Man is really good if you give him a brilliant energy, Alex. You should put him higher on the list. Okay, well, sure, you know, if you give a character enough armor, if you pump a character, if you have 150% HP on your cards and you have a brilliant regen, then you know what, Hulk does look better for PvP. But how many players can actually do that, right? It's just out of the realm of possibility at that point. So it's just not, it's not going to make sense to put that as part of the tier list, right? The tier list has to be grounded in reality, and the reality is 99.9% of players are never going to get a 5 or 6 star artifact for Heimdall unless they pull out of the Celestial Essence thing for free. So anyways, I don't want this to turn into an artifact rant, but I do want to highlight the danger of overhyping a character that needs a very specific item that's very hard to get, and then overvaluing them on a tier list compared to the other 248 characters because of that. So yes, I may be undervaluing Heimdall a little bit here, but I'm doing so, in my opinion, for the safety and the betterment of the community. I'm just trying to play it safe here. So yeah, hit me up in the comments down below. Let me know what you think of the latest tier list, and if we are getting Rocket and Gamora holiday uniforms, where do you think those uniforms are going to land them on the tier list? Hopefully here. I would love to see a meta-defining Gamora, but who knows? Thanks so much for watching. Smash the like button if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.